Welcome back. To those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Massimo Grassotti, and I'm part of the investor relations team here at East Capital Group, based out of our Stockholm office, which are our headquarters. It's been a roller coaster trying to keep up with all the updates between Russia and Ukraine, which is why for today's event, we've asked East Capital's Jacob Grapengiesser to join us and give us some insight from behind the scenes. Jacob is our deputy CIO, senior advisor, and partner at East Capital Group, based out of our offices in Moscow. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Jacob, good morning. And well, it is good morning if we look at the Russian markets. Have you got a little comment there quickly?
Well, the Russian market, it's lunchtime here. There's a 2-hour time difference, so it's 12 here. But the Russian market is doing relatively well. It's up 2.7% in dollar terms this morning, and I think this rally that we saw starting yesterday is sort of continuing today.
Yeah, perfect. Well, it's a good way to start then, right? So, Jacob, since we spoke last time, we've had a numerous amount of headlines, especially none other than from Western media, which seems to have shown and pointed towards suggestions that attack was not only reliable or was imminent, but very, very likely. How much of what the media has portrayed would you say is reliable and actually accurate?
Yeah, I think that a lot of Western media has simply exaggerated the risk of a war. We're not out of the woods yet, so it's too early to jump to any conclusions, I think. But I think it's been a bit of a one-sided reporting where the sort of media volume has really been 12 or 13 out of a scale of 10, right? So it's been kind of extreme media noise, and I think this has partially also influenced investors and the public in the West that a war is basically coming this week. I think that was pretty much the consensus. And when I was reading things in, for example, Swedish media, they said as well it's more about which day this week the war is going to start. When I speak to people in Moscow and people in Kiev, it's a very different point of view. Most people here think that there will be no war, and this is Russia and Ukraine are old friends. I mean, it's de facto kind of the same people. These are closer countries than Sweden and Norway. They're closer culturally, closely integrated in terms of millions of Ukrainians living in Russia and vice versa. I think another issue is a bit about the kind of semantics. So when the US says a distinct possibility of a war, that is being interpreted in many cases as a war is imminent, right? And I think it's a bit, important that politicians and media is responsible and try to portray risks for what they are. I'm not saying that there are no risks, but I'm saying that there was a bit of a panic, and I think media was sort of beating the same drum, and that's I think dangerous, because then maybe it almost becomes self-fulfilling. Then Europe moves troops to the to our borders, and then Russia might do the same thing. So yeah, a bit of a challenging situation, but hopefully we are slowly starting to resolve the situation.
Yeah, great. Well, that's what we're looking for. Staying a little bit on the idea and touching a little bit on what we have heard in the media, and we had some good sentiment yesterday, but there have also been rumors that Ukraine could be considering withdrawing their ambitions of joining NATO. And in this case, I mean, does this look like a plausible possibility or a possible scenario moving forward?
Well, it was the UK ambassador of the Ukraine that said that possibly we would consider this option. Those comments were later withdrawn. So I don't think that Ukraine will officially withdraw their ambitions to join NATO. that would be an easy solution, of course, to the problem, but I don't think they will do that. However, I think the real issue is that a membership in NATO for the Ukraine is not on the table now. It was not on the table 1 year ago, and it's not on the table now. And this is what Scholz said earlier this week. He says, well, I mean, we're discussing a NATO membership for the Ukraine, and in reality, that's not going to happen. So I'm not sure, what this whole fuss and mess is about. And I think that was that was probably an honest statement. Europe will never admit these things under pressure from the Russians. They will never say that, well, we won't let Ukraine join NATO because you're pressuring us. This is not how Europe works. But at the same time, to find some sort of compromise that it's not imminent in terms of Ukraine joining NATO, or possibly some sort of regulation of how, for example, missiles can be placed in Ukraine versus how they can be placed in Russia. I mean, some sort of diplomatic agreement like that, I think, is perhaps a way forward. And finally, of course, there is the Minsk II agreement. This agreement is considered relatively bad for the Ukraine, relatively good for Russia, but it was signed in the Normandy format. So Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine around the table. And if this can be implemented, I think that's a clear route towards de-escalation. The Donbas area will get certain rights. For example, they can hold local elections, and the constitution in Ukraine will be changed more towards a kind of a federal state where the different areas have simply more rights, and the central government in Kiev clearly doesn't want this. But I think for Russians it would be a good solution, and I think this would be a way to simply de-escalate and move on and have a more kind of stable solution in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, touching on what you just said, the de-escalation, right? I mean, Ukraine has been quoted saying that they won't believe the withdrawal of troops until they see it, right? That they feel that they've heard this before. But in the case where this does start to happen, which is sort of what we saw the positive sentiment based off of yesterday, right, and kick off yesterday, in the case where they do start to withdraw troops, could this be the start of an actual de-escalation? And in the case, how would that reflect on Putin? Would that seem maybe as defeat for him, or?
No, so Putin has played relatively well. He is now accusing the West of over-dramatizing the risk of a war, because the West is saying that the war is imminent. It's going to happen this week or tomorrow, and Putin is saying, well, I mean, where's the war? I mean, not a single shot has been fired. So Putin has kind of turned the narrative against the West quite skillfully. Again, you probably won't see it in the Western media, but in the Russian media, this is certainly the case. But that narrative also means for him that he cannot attack Ukraine, right? He cannot go to war. Then this narrative doesn't work. And that's sort of the narrative we've seen in the past 1-2 days. So actually, that narrative, I think the comments from Scholz, and then also a kind of public display of the Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Minister of Defense Shoigu, where they state kind of in front of the Russian people that we will continue with a diplomatic path and we will start withdrawing troops. All of these things together, I think, have turned into a much more positive direction, and hopefully this was a turning point. Again, we are probably not out of the woods completely, but I think the risk of a war, the risk of some very negative scenario has decreased significantly.
Yeah, it's obviously very difficult, as you said, right? As we spoke also last time, it's impossible to time the bottom of the market, and also, sentiment and what's like, and to say that we are out of the woods completely will always be very difficult to say. But with your expertise, you being on the ground, seeing everything, what sentiment is like there, would you, however, say, even though we are not out of the woods yet, would you be willing to say that maybe the worst is behind us?
Well, hopefully the worst is behind us. When I speak about Russia, I always go back to numbers, and I think it's up to investors themselves to decide if it's a risk worth taking. So if you look on the numbers as of this morning, I think what we're a little bit missing is that oil and other commodity prices are at either record highs or at least oil is on the highest level since 2014. So Brent crude is now $94 per barrel. The Russian market and the key stocks are up close to 20% in the past 3 weeks. But still, company, for example, like Lukoil would be at a 22% dividend yield at current spot price for oil and at current ruble rate. So it's still 22% dividend yield. And our fund is a reflection of that type of valuation. I just mentioned one valuation, but overall, of course, the fund is a reflection of those low valuations in general. So I think it's up to everyone and say, okay, what do I think is the risk of a bad scenario versus a good scenario? And when I look at these valuations, is that the risk worth taking? Personally, I think that oil prices will go higher. We might see 100, maybe even 110, $120 per barrel in the next 6 months. Then, Russia is probably one of the best places to invest. So yeah, I mean, let's see. The local investors are taking a slightly different view. The local investors in Russia had the highest ever on record inflow into the market in January. So they put roughly $1.5 billion into their own market. So the local investors are obviously, who are probably closest, to the events. They are, doing a bit the opposite, right? So the Western investors were very nervous, and the local investors were buying their own market big time.
Great. Would you be willing to say that sentiment then, since January, where we had all these record numbers, has it remained relatively stable then?
Well, again, for the local investors, they see this as an opportunity to buy cheaply. For the Western investors, I think they are still very, very nervous. They're still very much on the sidelines. But I would think that, in a week or two, the Western investors will start coming back to the market.
Great. Well, that's what we'd like to hear. Jacob, thank you very much for your time. That's it for us today. If you would like to hear more about our views on the markets or about our different strategies, please feel free to reach out to your IR representatives or any of us here at East Capital, and we'll be more than glad to help. Thank you, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.